Do you know why Pomni and Ribbit have the same eyelashes? What is the meaning behind these sketches of their early designs for the amazing digital circus? Let's start with Pomni. I'm sure no one expected Pomni's first design. Or did you ever imagine that Pomni could have been a frog? Well, yes, friends, even though it sounds pretty crazy, Pomni's first design was based on a thin frog and was even going to be a male frog. This idea was taken so seriously that Gooseworks decided to call him Frogny. He was going to have a black and blue striped design. Pretty unsettling, but at some point during the design, Gooseworks herself realized that a frog had nothing to do with a digital circus. So she redesigned the whole character and came up with the idea of a jester. The crazy thing is that it went from being a male frog to a female jester. But the frog design didn't end up being completely discarded, since it's believed that Ribbit's design was inspired by this first design of Pomni. Since Ribbit's eyes and eyelashes are identical to Pomni's, but the gossip doesn't end there. Because even when Pomni's design was almost finished, they still changed a detail that no one noticed. And those were her gloves. At first they were reversed. The left side was red and the right side was blue. But later they decided to switch them so they would match her clothes and shoes. That's why in the pilot she already appears with the blue glove on the left and the red one on the right. But an interesting fact is that in the end credits of this episode we can see Pomni with her design from before that change. Did you know that Kofmo was originally going to be much more important in the amazing digital circus? In fact, he wasn't just a clown who abstracted and that's it. He was intended to have a bigger role in the following episodes. Because he and Pomni were going to be the main protagonists of this circus. That's why Kofmo was a clown and Pomni was a jester. Because both of them represented the digital circus very well. Even his original name was Kaufman. And we can see this in one of the sketches where Ragatha calls him by this name. And with this, we can also confirm that he had a deeper development. And since she had already created Kofmo when Gooseworks created Jaxx, she realized that the purple rabbit seemed to play the same role as the poor clown. Gooseworks decided to get rid of Kofmo and keep Jaxx, since the clown was going to have a story similar to Jaxx's. Jaxx is one of the characters in the digital circus and had one of the strangest changes. Because if Pomni went from being a male frog to the Pomni we know, Jaxx was originally going to be a big girl. Yes, folks. Jaxx was going to be a girl. And in fact, this was confirmed to us by Gooseworks herself when someone asked her why one of Jaxx's sketches had eyelashes. And in fact, Jaxx is one of the characters who had the most designs before reaching the final design. We see how some of them look like the Jaxx we know, but there are also some pretty weird ones. Because look, there's even a Jaxx with just one eye. But let me tell you that these designs weren't just forgotten, because in episode 8 we can see the one-eyed Jaxx looking absent-minded just like in this sketch. And well, speaking of these weird things, why has almost no one talked about this concept where Jaxx says, "I'm in love with your fucking body"? Was he saying it to Zubel? I don't know, Rick. I'll leave that for you to figure out. Actually, for Jaxx's voice, Gooseworks wanted it to be something inspired by Raggedy Andy.
Look, we have names. Yours is Raggedy Ann and mine is Andy.
But Kovacs didn't want to copy it exactly, so he added this more cynical, mocking, and vulgar tone of voice. And that's how the unbearable voice of Jaxx was born. And well, my friends, the whole design of the psychopathic rabbit was heavily inspired by Poppy from Poppy the Performer, as well as a few things from Roger Rabbit. Ragatha almost wasn't called Ragatha. Originally, Gooseworks wanted to name her Emmy, and Ragatha was Emmy.
Ragatha was called Emmy, but then I didn't think it was that cool. I thought Ragatha was better.
But before the pilot came out, she decided to change her name and never really explained to us exactly why. And the funny thing is that, unlike these other characters, Ragatha didn't change her design. Her appearance stayed pretty much the same from her first sketches to her final version, but she did drop a pretty weird and bizarre idea. An idea that Gooseworks had for this ragdoll, since she was planning to put plush organs inside her. And in every scene where Ragatha was destroyed, we would see a bunch of plush organs flying around. But anyway, at least we can see that in some of these old designs, Ragatha looked even sweeter and more innocent, like a typical children's doll. Zubel's design didn't just come out of nowhere. His design comes from a triangular shape that Gooseworks had already been using before the amazing digital circus. In fact, we can see something very similar in old animations, like Elaine from Bounty Hunter, Ghost of the Year, and the Darned Boxman Show. So Zubel and his design are already part of this style that Gooseworks used, and in case you never noticed, Gooseworks never keeps a design completely fixed. Many parts of his body change throughout the episodes. We can even see these changes in the photo he has on his door inside the digital circus. And Gooseworks has said that this is completely intentional. This makes a lot of sense, since the character Zubel is inspired by a toy called Solo a Go-Go, which is basically several pieces of plastic with a weird and abstract design that you can assemble and customize however you like. Did you ever think that Kane could originally give you nightmares? Of course, guys. His first design had teeth that were way too realistic, not these more cartoonish teeth we know today. In fact, the whole vibe of the digital circus felt scarier and darker. Then there was another even weirder design for Kane, where his eyes weren't even inside his mouth. Instead, he had them on top. And of course, he looked way weirder than in his final design. In the design we know, Gooseworks made sure Kane kept that really exaggerated and chaotic look, but he still keeps a pretty interesting detail. Well, he has heterochromia, which means his eyes are different colors. In fact, did you know his green eye is named Jeffrey? But the gossip about Kane doesn't end here, friends, because his name could be a play on words, and for this, we have two options. It could come from canine, like the fang, or from Novocaine, which is a medicine dentists use so it doesn't hurt when they pull out a tooth. And to finish, once Gooseworks joked about what the letters that make up the name Kane mean. Well, she said that in her English version it means creative ass insertion newlywed experience, which in Spanish translates to newlywed experiences with creative ass insertion. But I think that in Spanish it would sound better as creation of adventures and insertion of experimental spankings. Kane. I know that Kinger seems like one of the most harmless and friendly characters in the digital circus, but I don't think we would have thought the same about his original design. Well, even though his design stayed almost the same, there was a pretty bizarre version when it came to his eyes. They were literally stuck to his chest piece head as if he were some radioactive mutation. And even though it sounds like a pretty insignificant change, just this detail gave poor Kingar a really creepy vibe. In the end, Gooseworks decided that the eyes should remain floating, just like his hands, and that's how it stayed for his final design, giving him that more absurd touch. And well, finally we have Gango, and I can say that he's one of the characters who barely had any changes. He stayed pretty much the same from the beginning since Gooseworks had his design completely defined, being just a body made of ribbons with his comedy masks. The only interesting detail we have about Kangol is found in his room. When they show us his room inside the amazing digital circus, we can see that he has a long collection of comedy masks. But among all these masks, we can find one that looks a lot like the faceless face from a short film Gooseworks made before the amazing digital circus. But what about Spotsy's, the restaurant we saw in episode 4? In fact, Gooseworks shared what the original depiction of the man who is supposed to have created the restaurant was going to look like. At first, he was going to be a potato with eyes, and he even had several designs, none of which apparently the creator liked. In fact, in a post, she herself said that in the end she decided to make this character look like the Colonel from KFC. She even shared what the official map of Spotsy's restaurant looks like. Here we can see that Spotsy's was modeled after a McDonald's where Gooseworks used to work. For episode 3, there were also several pieces of concept art, like the Demon Angel, which even had a version where wings came out of it. And several models where we can see its expressions and face, which clearly did appear in episode 3. But the most terrifying thing is that we see the concepts for the head ornaments of the scary characters, which yes, did appear in that episode. We even see that the little ghost had two different designs. The first one was much simpler. The one in the middle was the one that ended up in the episode, and the third is a reference to the meme of the dark-skinned guy who hides in the dark and smiles. Anyway, friends, did you know all this about the designs of the amazing digital circus? We'll be seeing you in the comments.